it's Rachel back with another video here on Live Study Hacks. Today we have a special guest, Professor B.J. Casey. B.J. Casey is an American psychologist and an expert on the adolescent brain development and self-control. She's a professor of psychology and affiliated professor of Justice Collaborator and interdepartmental neuroscience program at Yale University, where she's directing the Fab Lab. Professor Casey is one of the most cited scientists in developmental neuroscience with over 200 publications and over 50,000 citations. She has served on the editorial board for the Journals of Developmental Science, Journal of Cognitive Neuroscience, and BrainFacts.org. Her scientific discoveries have been featured on many media outlets such as National Geographic, Time, and NPR. Professor Casey has also studied the original participants in Michel's famous 1972 Stanford Bing Nursery School Marshmallow Experiment about self-control, which I posted a video on. Also in 2015 with the NIH, who funded the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, which is the largest long-term study of child and adolescent health and brain development in the United States. She was awarded $10 million as a principal investigator of the ABCD's Yale University site. I was lucky to take part of this study and become a teen ambassador under Professor Casey's guidance. I'm so happy to have you on, and I cannot wait to learn more about your research and inform our viewers about what is, in essence, the adolescent brain.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
So let's dive into our first question. So could you explain a little bit more about fear conditioning in relation to your research about measuring fear in adolescent mice and cued fear extinction in humans, more in particular like classical fear learning and cued fear and contextual fear?
So I think we might need to provide a little bit of context for that. So as someone who studies the adolescent brain, I want to know how the developing brain is responding to potential threats in the environment and also to potential rewards. And the potential threats that we originally were using were like fearful faces. But when you're looking developmentally, children, adolescents, and adults have different experiences with faces. So what you want to do is use a neutral cue and then pair it with something aversive so that that cue or that particular context or situation becomes aversive. And that way everyone has an equal experience with that association. So first, let me just start with cued fear, because I think that's simpler, and then we'll build off of that into contextual fear. So in cued fear in mice and in humans, all you have to do is pair like a simple tone or a visual cue just a few times with something aversive, like either a shock or a really loud noise. You know, sometimes these noises can be like a fingernail on a chalkboard, although in this day and age, we don't use chalkboards that much anymore. But just a few of those pairings, and then you look to see how well individuals learned by then just presenting the tone or the visual cue without the aversive sort of negative sound or the shock. And first we wanted to see if children, adolescents, and adults differed in how well they could learn a fear. And everyone does quite well. When there's something aversive, you learn very quickly, and that's probably adaptive to our survival. So in mice, you see freezing behavior when a tone is played that has previously been associated with a shock. And we're not really looking at freezing behavior in humans, but we look at something called galvanic skin response. And that's an indicator, it's like measuring perspiration or sweat, and that gives us an indication of arousal. And so we saw equal responses in children, adolescents, and adults in that galvanic skin response when we presented them a cue that had been associated with something negative previously. So then our next question was, when we were looking at, when we were using these fearful expressions originally, we saw this exaggerated response in adolescents relative to children and adults. And we didn't know if that was because, you know, you get this increased sensitivity to social cues and these are faces, or if they were having an exaggerated response at that time, or if their exaggerated response in the area of the brain, the amygdala, that's learning about the emotional significance of cues, if it was just that it was elevated because it continued to be activated every single time it saw that cue, as if it was still trying to understand the emotional significance of it. So with the cued fear learning, what we could do is to present the cue that was originally paired with something aversive, and we repeatedly present that and see how galvanic skin response we saw in adolescents compared to children and adults. And what we saw is this diminished ability to extinguish that fear memory in adolescence. And not only did we see that in humans, but we also saw that in mice. So that was an indication, seeing it across species during this period of time, is it something that has probably evolved in the species to be adaptive. That is, adolescence is a time when you have more opportunities to explore your environment without the protection of your caregiver. And this stage is really preparing you for becoming an adult and negotiating your world in a safe way. So when you're exploring your environment, if there are potential cues of threat, being highly vigilant about them may help with your survival. So that's sort of cued fear and what we saw. Also, I think this lack of extinction of fear may be related to the increased prevalence of anxiety disorders during adolescence. So it may put them at a little bit more of a risk for anxiety during this time, but if we have more time, we'll talk about that. So I want to contrast that against contextual fear. So in contextual fear, you do exactly the same things I described before with cued fear, only you put them back into the exact same context or chamber where the mice had been shocked before, and look to see how much they freeze, regardless. So you don't play the tone that was associated with the shock. And then we look to see, are young, adolescent, and older mice, are they learning that contextual fear equally well? And what we found is that young mice were freezing, and so were adult mice freezing. But the adolescent mice looked like they could care less when they were put back in that chamber, as if they were fearless. Now, does this mean that they weren't learning the information? No, it actually turns out, as is with science many times, we think we have these really clever experiments, but it's sort of serendipity where we end up a lot. Who performed these studies was Siobhan Patwell when she was a graduate student. And she hoped to complete her graduate work. And since she was doing this work with mice, she was having to review a lot of. She got access to for a lot of time, and she thought it might save her years in it might, sorry, you still hear me?
Yes, yeah, I can hear you. I think it's breaking up a little bit, but it's working now. Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. So she thought it might save her years in her graduate work if she didn't have to do all these review of all these hundreds of videotapes of mice in different behavioral paradigms of different ages. And so she took a random cage of animals. She pulled one conditioning chamber, and the minute she put them in the chamber, the mouse just huddled over to the corner. And she went, oh, phooey, someone has used the conditioning chamber. They clean it out. So they must be, there must be some odor that they're associating with fear. So she cleaned out the chamber, and she took another random mouse out of that same cage and put it in. And it was like the mouse was trying to get out of the chamber. What's going on with the mice? And she looked back at the notes on the cage, and these were the exact same mice who, as adolescents, looked like they were fearless, but it wasn't that they hadn't learned. They just weren't expressing that fear. But by the time that they were adults, they were expressing it, sort of. It's almost like an oxymoron to say there is an adolescent brain, because people want to say it's just not functioning during the teen years because some of the behavior that we as when we're teens engage in. So if you're exploring new environments, and you do get hurt or there's a danger, you come back and you decide, well, then I'm never going to explore these areas again because I don't want to get hurt or worse than that. Then that wouldn't be very adaptive. So during the adolescent period, when you're exploring, not expressing that fear behavior when you go out into contexts where you might experience that before, adaptive to help you to explore. And if you combine that with the cued fear, having a difficult time extinguishing a fear memory, at the same time that you're going out and you're still being vigilant about cues of potential threat, say like the odor of a predator of the sort. So that comment, we think, is perhaps quite adaptive. Now, yeah, I'll ask questions from there or get me to expand on anything.
Yes, so I had a question on contextual fear. So what I found surprising with the mice experimentation that you just explained right now, when you were given the same place, like these adolescent mice didn't react the same way. So is this because like the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex are not fully mature in these adolescent mice in these experiments to know that they are in the same circumstance? And how can that like affect the adolescents who are in middle school who are given the same situation but don't know how to act? And how can we prevent such an issue? Because I think the answer to this question will help like the viewers, because many students need to know how to react when a situation is given to them again, because I know they do. Yeah, so how can we like eliminate that?
So I described the phenomena as potentially adaptive. So I don't want to, a lot of people talk about rescuing typically developing and typically developing humans. So in a way, our expectations that we have evolved to have during adolescence. And it's not that you forget everything during adolescence, every situation. This was specific to threatening circumstance in which an individual may continue to explore. And so we would want to, might be informative to them in terms of thinking twice before they go back to a party location or a park where it's dangerous, and instead think of alternative safe places for them to explore. In terms of the changes that are going on in the brain is really dynamic during the adolescent stage, and unfortunately it's not simple enough to say it's all the prefrontal cortex or the hippocampus or the amygdala that I mentioned before. But there is what appears to be a surge in projections in an area of the prefrontal cortex from the amygdala that we think during cued fear is what is maintaining that fear arousal. And in contextual fear, we see that there are projections from the hippocampus to prefrontal cortex that seem to be associated with diminishing that fear response. And so sort of insight that we've gained from that is when you're trying to get rid of a fear memory, you may want to put them back into the exact same context that they were before, and that might help them. That might help to extinguish that memory better, because you're basically activating two competing behaviors. You're using those two competing behaviors, one where they still look afraid, and another where they just look fearless. And combining those, it's like the circuitry, these surges that we're seeing in these subcortical systems to areas of the prefrontal cortex, it might be canceling each other out. So sometimes when you're afraid, you don't put them back into that frightening. We can think of combat or veterans who have returned, but you can use virtual reality to try to get them back into that situation and place, say that they've heard, gunfire, but now that they're back, they might associate a car backfiring or some other noise that might trigger their anxiety. But putting them back in that potentially threatening environment using something like virtual reality might be helpful.
Okay, yeah, that's a good way to looking at it because I mean, I think fear is something that all adolescents go through and just maybe thinking rethinking about the circumstances that made them fearful can really help them um not have that fear again and go and without fear and to feel just use I hope that there's something like that, like virtual reality that can help adolescents combat the fear that they face.
Yeah, or just in their minds trying to recapitulate that environment and recognize that when they're in a safe environment, so that they can help sort of have coping skills to help regulate that, because we ruminate a lot when we're teens. And so also thinking about the cued fear memory, it's almost like ruminating of there's potential danger here, or I need to understand the emotional significance of the situation. And that may be another reason why often, even when there isn't any emotion in a situation, someone may just be they might be thinking about something else, but they're looking at us with a blank face. And so we find that threatening, and we might sort of continue to ruminate on, what did I do? What's wrong? And just recognize that it's typically not anything, right? It's just that when we look at people, often we're not really attending to what they're saying. I know that from when I give lectures, right? Sometimes my students are listening, but sometimes they're looking at me and they're not always paying attention every second of that lecture.
Yes, yeah. That's definitely good advice for anyone who's watching because they really need to I feel like it's something that there's a lot of misconceptions and I think just replaying that the whole situation will really help. So I think the next thing I would like to move on to is I also looked into your works regarding, right now we talked about Q of threat and what I found really big was anxiety because I know anxiety is a big issue that many teenagers face in my high school. I'm a high schooler myself, and just the semesters, the marking period for us, the semesters coming to a close. So anxiety is a big role that is facing adolescents right now, adolescent teenagers. So how exactly does the amygdala respond to these trait anxiety? What happens in the brain, and what is the correlation between the low and high anxiety adolescents?
So this refers to the experiment that I began talking about. And that was when we were using these expressions that looked like the individual was afraid. And we were seeing this exaggerated response in the amygdala to those cues in adolescents. So we were trying to understand, is it the magnitude of that response, or is it that once it's activated, this brain region continues to stay activated? And so what we saw is those young people who endorsed high levels of anxiety tended to show high levels of the amygdala activation even at the end of the experiment. So let me give you an example of what that looked like. So I'll try to do an expression of fear. And if I kept doing that multiple times, like the first time when you see somebody express fear, what we've learned is we don't know what, but there may be something somewhere going on. So we continue to look at that cue and we assess, is something bad happening to me? And with repeated presentations of that, it's kind of like, get over yourself. Nothing's happening, so everything's chill. And so what we should see is the activity in the amygdala learning that there's not a whole lot of emotional significance for this particular cue, except that it's relative safety. And so the individuals with high anxiety, they showed continued activation. And in fact, the ones who endorsed the highest levels of anxiety showed with the increasing, as you continue to present these cued fear expression, you saw even more activity, almost as if it was sensitization in the situation. And so that suggests that there's sort of this elevated sense. It's very difficult for these individuals to regulate their emotions. And I think that kind of informs what we do with cognitive behavioral therapy. It's one thing to continue to present triggers of anxiety, but you can't present those without already having worked with the individual to help them with coping mechanisms and teaching them how to sort of regulate themselves, because otherwise you might just get this rumination or this increased anxiety to potential triggers. So it's very in a safe environment, and I've worked with them to help them deal with the fear. It may be that they're still afraid, right? Like there are things that we might still be afraid of. We might be afraid of what we're going to score on a test. We might be afraid of when we got to a social event that we might embarrass ourselves or something like that. And so very, very important for those individuals who are experiencing anxiety to have coping mechanisms. They can sort of bring that back in so it doesn't prevent them from going out to parties or activities, and so that it doesn't get in the way of them studying for tests. Because what we know is when you get anxious, you get stressed, that can interfere with how well we process information and how well we remember it. So it tends to make us sort of ruminate and focus, as opposed to think more broadly in terms of considering all of life and the future, as opposed to the here and now. And teens largely think about the here and now, and it's hard to get them to think about the future, when the test will be over and what they'll do after study, they get a good grade, you know, and how will you celebrate, and focusing on that end point as opposed to stress out the test itself. Much of anxiety is the anticipation of the event, not the event itself. Does that help?
Yeah, that totally answers. Yeah, that totally answers the question. And you mentioned CBT, and like I know that like it does, like you mentioned, it doesn't really work a lot for for teenagers. Like I mean, like thanks to your work and like communicating with these therapists, like it just like I think it does do some work, but it needs some like I think improvement, obviously. And I think that like if what you were mentioning like right now, that like it's that like for teenagers they should look at the bigger picture of things and like looking into like the future and looking and not get too caught up in the moment. And so what other things that you suggest for teenagers to what are suggestions that you have for teenagers to cope up with their anxiety, that besides just looking at the future, something else that breathing techniques or something that can like help them really relax and relax the anxiety that they may face?
So I first just want to qualify that I'm not a clinician, and I also just want to correct a statement, because I don't want anybody to take from this that cognitive therapy doesn't work for adolescents. In fact, it is the most prominent of the treatments for anxiety and stress disorders, and it does work with at least 50% of participants. So our research, particularly that I talked about with cued fear extinction and it being diminished in adolescents, exposure-based cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, is really based on the principles of extinction learning. So exposure therapy is repeated presentations. And so if you don't extinguish fear memory very well, then that was a clue to us that adolescents might not show as big an effect in terms of exposure-based CBT. But there are a number of ways in which our lab and others has shown that you can enhance fear extinction, and we think that that's informing how we can optimize the way that we deliver, the way clinicians deliver CBT, but that's another whole, like, I give a couple lectures on that to go over that information. But I do think breathing techniques, meditation, and I mean, my drug of choice is exercise. Exercise is really important, just bringing it back in, and that might be in part two because you have that deep breathing and you get centered, and you can kind of think through things as opposed to just staying in that moment, but trying to, get out of that moment that's causing you the stress, the anxiety.
I think that really helps, those tips. I think teenagers really need to know to like there's time that they should like relax and exercise before something like to like diminish that anxiety response, like anxiety in their life. So I think the next question I have is about your research with early life stress and emotional regulation with adopted children. Could you explain more about that research? And you mentioned that it was surprising seeing how adopted children acted in a certain way that was quite different.
So I only have 2 more minutes. So what I'll say about early life stress is, again, I just want to emphasize how dynamic the brain is. So you can have these early life experiences and they can impact the way that you view the world or adapt to it. But with new experiences, then that can change your strategy and the way that you behave in the world. With studies in mice, these are extreme situations. If we expose them to early life stress, and you mentioned individuals who have been adopted or separated from their caregiver, the same thing with mice, when you separate them from a parent, or if you put them in an environment where that parent, the mouse mother dam, is really stressed, you see that that can lead to dysregulation in emotions, which suggests that for individuals who experience that, they might need earlier intervention. And many of the individuals who are adopted from orphanages are adopted by super moms. And when I mean super moms, it's any super caregiver, regardless of their gender. And it's they involve their youth in so many opportunities and experiences. And we see the longer that individuals are in an environment that is supportive, often that helps them to better regulate their emotions and their behaviors. And so the note to sort of end on is to have optimism, to never think any single experience is the all, that the brain is plastic, and it's particularly plastic during development. And that means that the more that we can provide the opportunities and the support that every human deserves to have, every human deserves a healthy development, the healthier those individuals will be, and the healthier our society will be for doing that.
Thank you so much, VJ Casey, for ending with that good note. And thank you so much for today's meeting. And I really appreciate this. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe and like. I really hope you learned something useful from VJ Casey. And see you guys next time. Bye.
Bye, Rachel. Take care.
Peace.